Every evening, a small puppy would quietly curl up outside the town hospital's entrance, enduring the bitter cold and loneliness. When Dr. Thomas Walker finally took notice and learned the story behind the puppy's nightly routine, he was deeply moved. What could cause such fierce devotion and sorrow in such a tiny creature? One particularly chilly winter night, the golden lights of the hospital reflected off the icy sidewalks as patients and visitors hurried by, bundled up in warm coats and scarves. Amidst the bustle, one lone figure remained, a tired puppy, his fur matted and his eyes weary. He lay near the revolving doors, not seeking food or shelter, simply staring at the entrance as though waiting for someone. Dr. Thomas Walker, a seasoned pediatrician known for his no-nonsense demeanor, first noticed the puppy as he was leaving the hospital. The dog's unwavering gaze caught his eye, and he paused, adjusting his scarf. "What's this little guy doing here?" he muttered. A nurse passing by overheard him and replied, "He's been here every evening for weeks. He must be waiting for someone." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Someone inside?" He looked at the puppy again, a stirring of sympathy in his chest. There was something in the dog's eyes, a tale of loss, a waiting heart, a deep longing. It was a sadness Thomas couldn't ignore. The next evening, as Thomas left the hospital again, his mind filled with reports and to-dos, he saw the puppy still in the same spot. Snowflakes clung to his fur, but the dog didn't move. His gaze remained locked on the hospital's entrance. Thomas hesitated. He wasn't usually one to fuss over animals, but there was something about this dog that tugged at his heart. Slowly, he approached and crouched down beside him. "Still here, huh?" Thomas whispered, his breath visible in the frigid air. The puppy lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching, but stayed still. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Thomas swallowed hard. "Do you have an owner?" he asked softly. The puppy's eyes, full of emotion, seemed to answer without words. The janitor from the previous evening appeared with his broom. "Talking to the pup again, Doc?" he teased. "He's been hanging around here for weeks. Some folks think he's waiting for someone, maybe a patient." Thomas glanced at the hospital, a sudden thought striking him. Was the dog's owner lying in a sterile bed inside? Or worse, had they passed away, leaving the loyal creature behind? Over the following nights, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the dog. Each night, without fail, the puppy remained, waiting silently. On one particularly bitter night, unable to watch the shivering dog any longer, Thomas fetched a blanket from his car. "Here, this should help," he murmured, gently covering the dog. To his surprise, the puppy allowed it, casting him a brief, trusting look before returning his gaze to the hospital entrance. That night, Thomas couldn't shake the image of the lonely puppy. Was he neglecting someone who needed help? As a doctor, he was accustomed to caring for others, but here was a creature outside his hospital, unnoticed and needing care. The next day, during his lunch break, he asked the receptionist if anyone had reported a missing dog. "Not that I know of," she replied, typing at her computer. "Do you think he belongs to a patient?" "Let me know if anyone asks about him," Thomas said, his mind racing. By the end of the week, his curiosity had turned to quiet resolve. Every night, he left food and water for the puppy, and each morning, the bowls were empty. Still, the dog stayed, loyal to the entrance of the hospital. One evening, as Thomas prepared to leave in his car, he saw the puppy curled up in his usual spot. Frustration and helplessness bubbled inside him. "Why won't you leave?" he muttered. But beneath that frustration, there was an ache, one he couldn't ignore. The next weekend, Thomas's routine was interrupted by a group of nurses gathered near the dog. One, a kind woman named Sarah, gently stroked the puppy's head. "He's letting us pet him now." Sarah smiled. "I think he's starting to trust us." Thomas knelt beside the dog, his hand hovering over his matted fur. "Is that so, little guy?" he asked quietly. As he stroked the dog's coat, the puppy didn't pull away. Instead, he looked up at Thomas, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. In that moment, Thomas realized he couldn't keep ignoring the dog. He had to know the truth. Why was this little creature so devoted to the hospital? And who or what was he waiting for? The next morning, Thomas arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, his thoughts consumed with the puppy. Who could the dog be waiting for? And why did he feel such a deep connection to this creature? He approached the receptionist once again. "Any updates on the missing dog?" he asked. "No reports, doctor." "Walker," she replied, shaking her head. "It's like he just appeared and made this place his home." Frustrated, Thomas decided to take matters into his own hands. After his morning rounds, he approached Sarah. "We need to do more," he said, his voice firm. "This dog didn't just wander here by chance." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You really care about him, don't you?" Thomas paused and nodded. "There's something about him, something we're missing." Sarah smiled. "I know someone at the animal shelter. Maybe they can check if he's microchipped." That evening, Sarah brought a leash, and with surprising ease, she slipped it onto the puppy. To everyone's shock, the dog followed without hesitation, trembling slightly. At the shelter, they scanned for a microchip, but there was none. "He's not registered anywhere," the technician said, frowning. "What now?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with frustration. "We could post his picture online," Sarah suggested. "Maybe someone will recognize him." They took a photo and shared it on social media and local community boards. "If he has an owner, they'll see this," the technician assured them. Days passed, but there was no word. Thomas found himself spending more time with the puppy, sitting beside him outside the hospital. One evening, as he sat on the cold steps, he spoke quietly to the dog. "I never really understood loyalty until I met you. My job, it's all about fixing things, moving on. But you stay, no matter what." The dog tilted his head, as if listening. Thomas chuckled. "You're a better listener than most of my colleagues." But as he looked into the puppy's eyes, a deep, unshakable sadness gripped his heart. "Who are you waiting for?" he whispered. The next day, while overhearing two elderly patients chat in the waiting room, one remarked, "That dog reminds me of a story I heard about a dog that waited for his owner outside a train station for years after the man passed." Thomas froze. Could it be? Had the dog's owner passed away, leaving him behind? Determined, Thomas asked Sarah if she could help him go through patient records. "It's a long shot," he admitted. "But what if the dog's owner was admitted here and never left?" They spent hours combing through the records, and finally, Sarah found something. "Thomas, look at this," she said, pointing to a file for an elderly man named Edward Langley. He had been admitted 3 weeks ago after a heart attack and passed away shortly after. No next of kin. Thomas's heart sank. Could this be the dog's owner? "Do you think the dog knew he was here?" Thomas whispered. Sarah's voice was soft. "It's possible." Later that evening, Thomas sat on the hospital steps again, the puppy curled beside him. "Edward Langley," he murmured. The dog's ears twitched. "Is that your person?" he asked. The dog didn't move, but his eyes softened, as if acknowledging the name. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. "I'm sorry you lost him," he whispered, gently brushing his fingers through the dog's fur. For the first time, Thomas reached out and stroked the dog's coat. The puppy leaned into the touch. "You're not alone anymore," Thomas said softly. "I'll make sure of that." As Thomas realized the bond between the dog and Edward Langley was undeniable, a deep sense of responsibility stirred within him. He had to learn more about this devoted dog and the man who had been his companion. Thanks for watching.